Let's talk about a time when the two most powerful nations on Earth were locked in a global staring contest, and they both had nuclear weapons. For decades, it was all about threats. But then, for this brief, kind of strange moment in history, they actually started talking. This is the story of detente.
Can you imagine growing up with this constant low-level fear that the world could literally end at any moment? That was the reality during the Cold War. One bad move, one misunderstanding, and boom, global nuclear war. So the question on everyone's mind was, how do you step back from that kind of cliff edge?
At the center of all this, you had two superpowers. On one side, you've got the United States and its allies pushing for capitalism and democracy. And on the other, the Soviet Union and its allies representing communism. They were locked in this intense, bitter rivalry for influence all over the planet.
Now, what's really wild is the crazy logic that kept the peace. It was a strategy called mutual assured destruction. And yeah, the acronym is MAD. The idea was simple, but also totally terrifying. If one side launched a nuclear attack, the other side would launch everything they had right back. The result? Both countries would be completely wiped out. Nobody could win, so nobody would be crazy enough to start. It was basically a peace held together by the threat of total destruction.
Okay, so if this terrifying balance was the only thing keeping the world from blowing up, what could possibly make these two massive rivals change their minds? What made them decide to take a step back and try something completely new? Well, the answer comes from a French word, détente. It literally just means relaxation. And it's the name we give to this period where the leaders of the US and the Soviet Union made a conscious choice to ease the tension. Instead of just shouting threats, they decided to try, talking.
So why this sudden change of heart? Well, it was a few big things all at once. For one, both countries were pouring insane amounts of money into building more and more weapons, and their economies were really feeling it. The US was also stuck in the really long and very unpopular Vietnam War. At the same time, the Soviet Union's economy was struggling, and they desperately needed things like Western technology and grain. And on top of it all, everyone, everywhere, was just terrified of a nuclear war.
So they decided to cool things down. But what did that actually look like? This is where we get into some really historic agreements, and even a famous handshake in space.
The most logical place to start was with the weapons themselves, right? If you want to lower the risk of war, you've got to do something about the endless arms race. So this led to a series of really important meetings called the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks.
The goal of these talks, which everyone just called SALT, was huge. For the first time, these two enemies weren't just trying to outbuild each other. They were actually sitting down at a table to agree on a limit. They were trying to put the brakes on this arms race that was just spinning out of control. And it worked. The result was the SALT-I Treaty in 1972. You can see they agreed to just freeze the number of their most powerful missiles. But here's the really clever and kind of strange part. They also limited their anti-ballistic missile systems. Those are the shields designed to shoot down incoming nukes. Now, why would you limit your own defense? Well, it guaranteed that both sides stayed vulnerable, which locked in that mad logic and made sure neither country felt confident enough to even think about launching a first strike.
And this new vibe wasn't just about weapons. It was a total shift in how they operated. The old way, as you can see here, was all about threats and suspicion. The detente way was about talking, diplomacy, trade, and even sharing scientific research. All of a sudden, you've got American farmers selling wheat to the Soviets. It was a whole new playbook.
The year 1975 was probably the absolute peak of all this cooperation. In July, something that would have seemed impossible just a few years earlier happened. An American Apollo spacecraft docked with a Soviet Soyuz spacecraft in orbit, and the commanders actually shook hands in space. Then, just a month later, another major agreement was signed back down on Earth.
That agreement was called the Helsinki Accords. It did two main things. First, everyone agreed to accept the borders in Europe as they were, which brought a lot of stability. And second, all the countries that signed it, including the Soviet Union, promised to protect the basic human rights of their own citizens. That little detail about human rights would turn out to be a really big deal later on.
But as good as all this sounds, this new peace was pretty fragile. The deep-seated distrust between these two superpowers didn't just vanish overnight. The whole thing was about to face some major tests.
Because underneath all the handshakes and treaties, the big problems were still there. They were still rivals, fighting for influence in other countries. And in both Washington and Moscow, you had powerful people, we call them hardliners, who were suspicious of the whole thing. They basically argued that the other side couldn't be trusted and was just using detente to get ahead.
They even managed to negotiate a second treaty, SALT II, which would have reduced the number of nuclear weapons. But by 1979, the political atmosphere in the U.S. had really changed. A lot of politicians felt the treaty was too favorable to the Soviets, and the U.S. Senate never officially ratified it, meaning they never gave it that final stamp of approval. It was a huge sign that trust was falling apart.
And then came the event that ended it all. Just look at this timeline. In June of 1979, the leaders are signing this big arms reduction treaty. Just 6 months later, Soviet tanks roll into Afghanistan to prop up a communist government there. And with that one move, the era of détente came to a crashing halt.
From the American perspective, the invasion was just pure aggression. It completely destroyed the trust that had been so carefully built up over the past 10 years. The U.S. retaliated by cutting off grain sales and boycotting the 1980 Moscow Olympics. The relaxation was over. The Cold War was back on.
So you might be thinking, okay, if it all fell apart, why do we even study it? Well, that's because even though it didn't end the Cold War, détente left behind a really powerful and important legacy. You know, détente taught the world some incredibly valuable lessons. It showed that a shared fear can actually push people toward peace. It proved that talking directly is way better than just shouting threats. It showed that having personal relationships between world leaders can make a real difference. And maybe most importantly, it proved that trust is everything. It takes years to build, but it can be broken in a single moment. And this right here might be the biggest takeaway. Even when things got really tense again in the 1980s, those channels of communication that were set up during détente, they stayed open. The leaders could still pick up the phone and talk to each other, which helped prevent a simple mistake from accidentally turning into World War III. That alone made the whole thing worth it. In the end, the story of détente is a powerful reminder that peace isn't something that just happens. It's an active choice. It shows us that even the most bitter enemies can decide to step back and choose cooperation over conflict. And that leaves us with a pretty big question to think about. What can this strange moment in history teach us about how to solve the biggest global conflicts we're facing right now?